This talk is on chapter 25. We're almost done now. There's only one chapter after this. In the next chapter that we talk about, when I do it in class, I actually do it using examples. I will put the examples that I use on Canvas, and during the talk, I will just kind of tell you how to figure out those examples that I have. This chapter, chapter 25, is probably one of the easiest ones that you'll do. We start off by talking about what the general principles are that are outlined in Article 2, and for the most part, we've talked about this before, we've mentioned this, and it should be easy for you to follow up. Then we'll get into the ones that are a little more specific to Article 2. I will tell you that next week on Monday night, because this one will go online on Wednesday, the 22nd, next week I will put the last test online. It's that time already. This test will probably take you a little more time. I'm probably going to release it a little earlier than the 29th. It is the hardest of the 3 tests that you will have taken, and I would just encourage you to use all your notes, use everything that you have at your that's available to you to answer the questions on the test. But it might take you a little bit longer to answer this one. Okay, so let's start off with some of the general principles. The general principles are that everyone's going to act in good faith. Good faith means that it's honesty in fact and the conduct or transaction concerned. And if you're a merchant again is somebody who's in the business of selling the goods, if you're a merchant, it's a little bit higher standard. You have to follow reasonable commercial standards and a fair dealing. If you ever had to go into court, this is almost always alleged that you have breached this duty to act in good faith. That usually in these kinds of cases gets resolved as the case goes forward. But if you did ever have to bring someone in, then you would have an expert in your industry that would kind of say, this is what we do. This is the commercial, this is the standard of fair dealing that our industry has. Okay, so just remember that always in the UCC, and it's in the UCC Article 2, it specifically states this, that everyone is presumed and must act in good faith. Okay, time. In a contract under Article 2, if it's a non-delivery contract, in other words, there's no requirement in the contract, nothing says that it's got to be, the goods have got to be delivered, then the duties of the buyer and the seller are concurrent. It means they happen at the same time. Okay, you walk in and say, I'll buy that item, you get the item, you pay the money. It all happens at once. And that is in a cash sale where there's nothing about delivery in the contract. If there is something about delivery in the contract, then, we talked before about place of shipment, destination. If there is something in the contract about where those goods are supposed to be delivered, then Article 2 will decide when the obligations come into place. Refer back to that chapter that we talked about where title changes, where risk of loss comes back, and talks a little bit about when the obligations arise. Okay, a repudiation of the contract is a refusal to perform the contract when the time comes for performance. Sometimes refusal in the law, it sounds very harsh, and sometimes the people aren't able to perform, but at this point we really don't care. The time came for performance, they didn't perform, that's a refusal to perform, that's a repudiation of the contract. That's the word that is used, it's a repudiation of the contract. We've talked before about what happens and what it's called when that repudiation happens before the time for performance. When the other side calls you up and says, look, I can't do it. I just can't do it. Or something happens that makes you believe that there's no way the other side is going to be able to perform. the night before they're supposed to deliver the goods to you, the only factory that they have, and one where you know your goods are being stored, burns to the ground completely. Not going to be delivered tomorrow. Okay, that one is where you have anticipatory repudiation. It's anticipatory because the time for performance hasn't come yet. But you have reasonable grounds then to believe it's not going to happen when the time does come. Okay, so if you have reasonable grounds to believe that the contract is not going to be performed when it's supposed to be, then you have the right to ask for adequate assurance of performance. You being the one that's supposed to get these goods. All right? So you can make a demand that the other side tell you for sure they're going to be able to perform. What this demand is, what a good form of assurance will be, depends on the circumstances. If parties have a track record of working for each other, if the party has a history of having a really good reputation, if they have a great credit history, if they've never had a problem in the past, then maybe all that has to happen is you call them up and say, I'm afraid you're not going to be able to perform on Thursday, and they tell you, oh, don't worry about it, we'll be there. Everything's going to be the way it's supposed to be. That could be an adequate assurance of performance. However, let's say that it's a company that you've never dealt with before, it's a new company, it's a startup, they don't have a track history, you don't have anything where you can look to see, well, they've always performed in the past. It's possible at that point that you could request a bond of some kind, which usually involves an insurance company. You could require a performance bond, that they have to go out to a third party and get a third party to say, if they don't perform, we'll put up the money. Any damages that you might have, we're going to cover it. So you have, when you ask for an adequate assurance of performance, there's a wide scale on what that adequate assurance could be, and it depends on the circumstances of the case. Again, this isn't a tremendously good remedy if you really think the person is not going to perform. Because under the UCC, they have 30 days to give you this adequate assurance of performance. So you've got 30 days where you don't quite know what's going to go on. If it's not given within 30 days, then the party who asked for this, and again, in your book you'll see that, we don't ever say ask, say demanded. They demanded the adequate assurance of performance, they didn't get it, they can treat the contract as repudiated. Remember, repudiated means that they didn't perform when they were supposed to perform. So if you're treating it as repudiated, you are then going to be free to go buy the goods someplace else and sue, and of course, hope that you were right, that they couldn't perform. That after 30 days, you have the right to treat the contract as if it's been repudiated. They've got to respond to you within that 30 days. Okay, so what are the duties of a party under an Article 2 sales contract? Really very simple. A seller has a duty to deliver. The buyer has the duty to accept the goods and pay for them. It all boils down to that. There's a lot more that we're going to go through that's in the book, but those are the two duties. Seller has the duty to deliver. Buyer has the duty to accept and to pay. And that's it. Okay, so what about this seller's duty to deliver? Okay, well, they have to deliver what the contract calls for. If they deliver something else, then that's a repudiation of the contract. So they have to deliver the goods according to the terms of the contract. All right, now, if you have a non-delivery contract, if you've forgotten any of this, refer back to that chapter that talks about transfers of title and risk of loss to find out exactly what that is. But your non-delivery contract then the seller's business or their residence, if they're not a merchant, it would be their residence, if they have no business at all, then that is where the goods need to be. And the seller has then performed their obligations. Now, there are some exceptions to this. This is law after all. You can change this in your contract. You can have some other terms in there, or you may have some other agreement. You're free to do that. But if there is no other agreement, the place of delivery is the seller's place of business or the residence if they don't have a business. Okay? So if there is no time anywhere in there about shipment or delivery, if nothing that, then the shipment is required within a reasonable time. If for some reason or other the method of transportation that you have called for in the contract becomes unavailable, then you are entitled to use a commercially reasonable substitute if it's available. The goal of Article 2, and most of contract law actually, is to make sure that there's a way for contracts to be performed. We don't want contracts to be breached. We don't want contracts to be repudiated. We want the parties to be able to work with each other in good faith and perform the contract according to its terms. Okay, so first you look at the contract and see what the contract says. And then if there is nothing in the contract, then we are going to look at Article 2 and see if it addresses the issues, and in most times it does. It provides a method of handling your problem. Okay? So, for example, if you don't state the time, it's going to be a reasonable time. If your method of transportation is not available, then a commercially reasonable substitute is going to be okay if that's available. All right? Now, the buyer does have the right to insist that all the goods that they've ordered be delivered all at the one time. If the seller delivers more or less than the quantity the contract calls for, the buyer has the right not to accept them. On a consumer kind of issue where this might sometimes occur is, let's say that you went into a furniture store and you ordered a bedroom set. And your bedroom set was going to consist of a frame for the bed, a headboard for the bed, a bureau, and a mirror. That's what you were going to get. And then when it came to your house, because that's your terms, that it was going to be delivered to your house, then they didn't have the mirror with them. You would have the right to say, I don't want this. This is not what the contract called for. You don't have all of it here. I don't want it. Take it back. Now, of course, sometimes they tell you, well, if we take it back, it might get damaged in the warehouse waiting for the mirror. You don't have to take damaged goods either. We'll get to that in just a minute. So it's up to the buyer, it's up to them whether or not they decide to send it back or not. Okay? All right, so that's the seller's duties. The duty of the seller to deliver according to the terms of the contract. All right, now, what about the buyer? What is the buyer supposed to do? Well, the first duty of the buyer is to accept the goods. And accept kind of has a legal meaning that we're going to be talking about here. You have to do certain things before we say, yes, you have accepted. All right, so first, okay, unless it's a COD order. COD, the rules are different because in COD you've got to pay first. But if it's not a COD, not cash on delivery, the buyer has the right to examine the goods when they're tendered, offered by the seller. Okay? The buyer, during this right to inspect, has the right to count to make sure that however many commercial units they've ordered is there. They have the right to remove them from cartons and make sure that it is actually what it is that they had ordered. And if necessary, they have the right to conduct tests on the goods to make sure that they work the way that they were supposed to and that the way they were promised to them. So the buyer has a right to do this. If the buyer doesn't exercise their right to do this, then this could wind up with big problems for the buyer in the future. So it is really always to the buyer's advantage that they do inspect the goods. And on a consumer level, you'll notice that sometimes, like in Frankenmuth, if you go to Frankenmuth and you shop at Bronner's, before you leave, they will take whatever you purchased, they'll open it up, take it out, and make you examine it before they repackage it and send you on your way. And I'll get to why they do that in just a second. But they insist that you inspect it. You should always inspect it if you are the buyer. It's a big problem if you are the one that's in purchasing and somebody makes a delivery and they have a certain number of boxes and they just put the boxes on wherever you're having them delivered, and you just look over and say, oh, that looks right. And then later on it turns out 3 or 4 of them are missing. There's just not enough numbers there. That's a problem. So you really, as a buyer, should exercise your right to inspect. And why? Because if you find something not right, you have the right to reject the shipment. Okay? Now, if the goods don't conform in any way, you can reject. You can only reject before you've accepted, and we'll get to the definition of accepted in just a second. But you can reject them for any reason. The buyer has the right to reject the whole shipment, say this is not right, I've looked at this, I've inspected it, it's not what I was supposed to get. They can accept the full shipment, and with the right that if it's diminished the value of the contract to them, they can get the money difference, the damages for that. Or they can accept any commercial unit and reject the remainder. Let's say that you were going to have 10 refrigerators delivered to you, and you got 10 refrigerators and you were inspecting the refrigerators and you realized that 7 of them, this is probably never going to happen, it's not realistic, but 7 of them that were delivered to you didn't have any doors on them. You could keep the 7 that were delivered the way they were supposed to be and send the other 3 back. Might have got my numbers wrong there, but you get the idea. You keep the ones that are good, send the ones back that are no good. You couldn't say then keep half the refrigerator. You either keep it or you don't keep it, a commercial unit. Okay? So at that point, before you have accepted the goods, the buyer is definitely got all the cards in their favor. They have the right to reject, and if it's not perfect. Now, they have to do this within a reasonable time. I mean, your inspection can't take forever. Although some inspections, depending on what goods you're talking about, you may have ordered an engine and you may have to put a lot of miles on that engine before you figure out whether or not it works the way you have been promised. So it depends on the goods, how long this period of inspection could be. But it would have to be a reasonable amount of time to inspect depending on the goods that were being delivered. And then if you're not going to take the goods, then you've got to notify the seller. I mean, you can't just sit back and say, oh, I'm going to reject these goods. I'm not going to tell anybody. You've got to tell them. Part of the reason for that is that usually also you have to tell them why you're rejecting them. The reason for that is that the seller will have the right to cure. If they can possibly fix the problem within the terms of the contract. Maybe they delivered early and they have some more time and they figure out, oh darn, those 3 refrigerators that didn't have doors on them, we can get the doors and put them on and send them out again. They can do that. They have the right to cure. The whole purpose of Article 2 is not to punish the other side, is to try to figure out a way when everything can be carried out the way it was supposed to. Excuse me. So if you're rejecting the goods, you have to notify the seller. Usually you have to tell the seller the reason for the rejection. And then if possible, they have the right to cure, meaning get you the goods they were supposed to do that, and hopefully within the time period of the contract. All right, let's assume then that you got the goods, you inspected the goods, and you decide you're going to keep the goods. Well, that's your acceptance, and remember that's the first duty of the buyer is that they have to accept the goods. You inspected them, they appeared to be fine, you've taken them, you have converted them to your own use, it looks like you're planning on keeping them permanently. You may have modified them in some way, you may have monogrammed them, put your initials on them, which makes it look like you're going to keep them. You didn't return them within, or make any attempt to return them within a reasonable period of time. You've made continued use of the goods, no indication that there was anything wrong. So you have accepted them. All right? That makes a big difference. Because if you accept the goods, and then you find out that there is something wrong, it's much harder on the buyer's part. Now, the buyer can revoke acceptance. Revoke meaning take back. They can take back their acceptance of the goods, but only if one, the defect, whatever it is you're saying is wrong with the goods, has to substantially impair the value of the contract. We're way past this if they're not perfect. No, we're not talking about that anymore. They have to substantially impair the value of the contract. And they have to be a defect that you couldn't have discovered before you accepted them. So while you were doing your inspection, this is not something that you would have been able to discover. It would have taken a much longer period of time. So it's got to substantially impair the value of the contract. It has to have been one you couldn't have found if you had inspected the goods. If the buyer decides they do want to revoke their acceptance, they've got to give notice to the seller. This is one of these things again. None of this can be done in secret. None of this can be hidden. You have to tell the other side that I am planning on revoking acceptance of these goods. Okay? And that has to be given, that notice has to be given within a reasonable amount of time after you discover the defect. So let's say that you got the goods in June, you've been using them, it's now December, now you find this defect, it's finally come to light, this is something you couldn't have found before. So you bought them in June, found that defect in December, you're sure it substantially impairs the value of this contract to you, and then you decide to wait till the next June to tell the seller about the problem. Don't wait. You have to tell them within a reasonable amount of time. And sometimes those reasonable amount of times are relatively soon that they come up. Okay? So you got to tell them about the problem. Then, after they've revoked acceptance, the buyer has to hold the goods and wait for the seller to tell them what to do, which is part of the reason you have to tell the seller. Okay? And if you've already paid for them, which is a very good possibility, then the buyer can keep the goods that are in their possession until they get a refund of the money from the seller. This could very well set up a lawsuit. If you're rejecting goods, buyer's in a much better position. After you accept, and you can only revoke your acceptance, it's much harder to revoke acceptance than it is to reject the goods. Okay, but that's the buyer's duty, to accept the goods. Their other duty is to pay for the goods, which probably should be kind of reasonable for you. And it should be in the contract. If it's nothing in the contract about the amount of money, because remember in a sales contract, you need to state the goods, we have to know that you intend to make a contract, and we have to know the subject matter, and we have to know the quantity, not necessarily the price. If it's not the price, it's usually based on market value or a reasonable price, but the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2, will help you figure out what the price is. Okay? So the time for payment is either concurrent, if it's a non-delivery kind of contract, or whatever it says in your contract. You can decide in your contract that payment could be made in advance, You could decide in your contract that payment could be made 60 days later. You could decide in your contract payment will be made when you feel like it. I mean, I don't know too many contracts that are like that, but you could. You could do that kind of thing in the contract. But if it's not in the contract, then it's going to have to be paid concurrently. Okay, now, what kind of payment? All right, well, technically, the only kind of payment is cash. Obviously, we don't really use cash very much, especially if it's a large kind of contract. So the seller can agree, and it's usually better to work this out beforehand. The seller could agree to take a cash payment or a promissory note or a credit card or any of those kinds of things. A check is a conditional payment. You are not considered to have paid your contract out until that check actually clears the bank. All right, so if the seller is allowed to refuse to accept a check or a promissory note, but they've got to give the buyer, if they refuse that, they have to give the buyer time to come up with legal tender, and legal tender is cash. That's why I'm saying it's a whole lot better if you work that out in advance, what kind of payment is going to be accepted. Because you don't want to have the goods sitting right there and then they go, oh, I'm not taking your check. And the seller has the right to refuse a check as long as they don't do it on a discriminatory basis. They have the right to refuse to take your check. They have the right to try to make sure that they have either cash or some other kind of certified form of payment. They've got the right to do that. All right, and then we come back to what they've talked about in a few of the other chapters, and that is commercial impracticality. This is, I guess, what you would call a rising doctrine, not widely used, but we've had a whole lot of things come up in recent times that people could not have anticipated. 9/11 probably wasn't anticipated. The scope of the pandemic that we're in right now, it doesn't appear to have been anticipated to the extent that it is. So some of these theories that in the past would have just been not used at all in court are beginning to be used more and more. One of them is this commercial impracticality. The standard is objective, not subjective. And if you recall the difference, objective, nobody could do it. Subjective, you can't do it. And we're looking for ones where no one could do it. Just because it costs more money is not the standard for commercial impracticality. Generally speaking, anticipating paying more money is something people probably should do. And if you can't, then there's bankruptcy court. It would have to be something where it was totally unexpected, and nobody could perform this contract. It was just something out of your control, something you can't do anything with. Okay, as I've said, this is a really short chapter. It's not real complicated. The things you need to remember out of it are the seller's duty is to deliver the goods according to the terms of the contract. A buyer's duty is to accept those goods and pay for those goods. A buyer has the right to inspect. If they inspect and the goods are not what they wanted, not what they ordered, not what's in the contract, then they have the right to reject those goods. If they've accepted the goods, then they have the right to revoke acceptance. But to revoke acceptance, it has to be substantially impair the value of the contract, be a defect they could not have figured out before by inspection. Okay? Please take your time with the third test.